Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this penultimate session of the conference. It's a pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon. My name's Professor Beverly Milton-Edwards. I'll be chairing the session. I have an international security and international studies background, and I'm currently serving as Senior Policy Advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This afternoon's panel on international security, I think, presents us with a number of very interesting overarching themes. So we'll have a very interesting array of presentations, which are both geographical in breadth, as well as theme. But I think that the individual papers in and of themselves will provide us with some very interesting opportunities for reflection. And the challenge here for us is to think about the overarching themes. So without much further ado, the structure of the panel this afternoon, I will do some short introductions, but I do hope that you've had an opportunity to look at the biographies of a very, very distinguished panel of experts, both in terms of theorizing about the field as well as practical experience and expertise. And then we'll offer our panelists about 20 minutes per presentation, and then there will be an opportunity for all of you to ask your questions and to hear some answers. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, who specialises, and his presentation today will specialise or focus on nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear forces, and the challenges that we face by the recent geopolitical developments across the globe. I think you're going to focus both on Russia and China in your presentation. Hamish will be followed by Tomasz Smura, and he will, in a sense, be picking up the thread of looking at the strategic challenge or perceptions of challenge that China presents. And his paper or his presentation will be looking at the reform and modernization of the PLA, what that means in a strategic context of the Indo-Pacific region. In particular, I think you're going to maybe focus a little bit on Taiwan, and the implications for the rest of the world in terms of strategic and containment strategies. Your paper will then be followed by Tony Lawrence, who brings us back to the thread of Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and looks at the extremely important topic, one that's pertinent today, literally as we speak, of military assistance, and those foreign nations, both in Europe and beyond Europe, who are looking at their objectives in terms of military assistance to Ukraine against Russia and the limited amount of military assistance that Russia itself has been receiving from some state actors. One of those state actors being the topic of our final presentation from Mahjoob Zweiri, which will be looking at Iran and new regional security dynamics. I'm not going to place the burden of asking you to go beyond the region and back into the Russia-Ukraine theatre. But if you would like to, I'm sure that would be very much appreciated, or it may well even come up in the questions and answers. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Hamish to deliver the first presentation. Thank you.
Just so I get the slides up, first of all, thank you very much indeed to everybody here at the Institute and the Arab Centre for inviting me back to Doha, one of my favourite places in the world. Haven't been here for a few years, but it is great to be back amongst this really academic conference. I think I'm a bit of an anomaly. I'd hardly call myself an academic amongst some of the high-class academics that are here. Although I am a Cambridge Don, I'm very much there for my practical background. Last 35 years on the battlefields of the world, 23 as a soldier and 12 as a humanitarian / advisor. But what I want to talk about I better start my stopwatch, so over the next 20 minutes, is the nuclear moment. We are in an incredible time. In my opinion, never has the nuclear threat been higher, even during the Cold War, or never has the discussion of the nuclear threat being higher, and it pays our undivided attention. Now, I'm looking very much towards Russia at this stage. From the beginning of the conflict, and I have, despite the fact English being my first language, I seem unable to say nuclear all the time. And if I go into nuclear, I apologise from the start. But from the very beginning of the conflict, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin has been using the nuclear card. And I think we have paid lip service to it since the beginning of the Cold War. Now, why at the end of the Cold War? Why is Putin using the nuclear card? It is to keep NATO out of Ukraine. Now, I've just written a paper with Professor Bob Seeley, who's a member of the British Parliament and also an expert in Russia. We've written a paper for the American government entitled, "Will Putin Go Nuclear in Ukraine?" It was supposed to be published last week, and it was written in November, but anybody who writes for the US government, and no criticism of them at all, will know how difficult it is to get stuff published. I think we're in iteration 37 at the moment, but I'm hoping it's published tomorrow, or at least this week, and you will have access to it. Spoiler alert, our conclusion is it would be unbelievable for Putin to go nuclear in Ukraine. However, he has done a lot of unbelievable things. Our assumption that Putin will not go nuclear, I think, is a failed assumption. And one of our advice to the US government and its allies is we must assume that he will go nuclear, plan against it to make sure he doesn't. But I'll come to it in my conclusion. I still think it is very unlikely that the Russians will go nuclear. And let's face it, NATO and the world, most of the world, is heavily engaged in supporting the Ukrainians over the last 12 months, and Putin hasn't gone nuclear. I also, in my title, talk about unconventional violence and the material of modern warfare. Sort of links back to what Anthony King was talking about this morning, for those of you who are here, and really very seminal with my experiences in Syria. I spent 10 years in Syria trying to protect people against chemical attacks, and it was very profound to me. Our paper to the US government also covers the possible use of chemical weapons in Syria, in Ukraine rather, on the basis that they proved so successful for Assad in Syria. And I was very close to Aleppo in December 2016 when Aleppo fell to the Russians and the Syrian regime. After 4 years of conventional fighting, 17 days of chlorine barrel bombs broke the siege. Basically, once you destroy a city through conventional means, it is very difficult to get people out of it. But the chlorine barrel bombs went underground. They either killed people underground or forced them above ground where they were captured or shot. So that was very seminal. The other piece to me, and I know we're not talking about our backgrounds, but I also had the great honour to be the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor for 2 years in the fight against Daesh in northern Iraq, and I was with them in Mosul when Daesh fired chlorine mortars at us, so I have very personal experience of being under chemical attack. But like all these sort of threats, if you face them head on, there is always mitigation and resilience that you can provide against them. But it does illustrate one thing about CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear. The psychological aspects of it are really 10 to 1 the physical. Now, the First World War is synonymous with the use of chemical weapons, but only 0.01% of casualties were caused by it. It's the same in the Syrian conflict. You are 10,000 times more likely to be killed by conventional means than you are by unconventional means. But in Syria, I remember very clearly a doctor in Aleppo telling me when I told him not to worry about this. He said, Hamish, we can hide from bombs and bullets. We can't hide from gas. And that is something that is absolutely fundamental in the CBRN sphere. Very quickly want to cover this unconventional violence. As I said, a lot of experience in Syria. Certain Russian general called Savaikin, who was a commander there, who devised the Russian tactics of attacking civilians, attacking schools, attacking hospitals, allowing the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons. The very same man who is commanding Russian forces in Ukraine at the moment, and the same playbook. The thing, if you can't beat the military, beat the civilians into submission. And that is a horrific reflection, and that is why we're all trying so hard to make sure that Ukraine prevail. A key element to this unconventional warfare is taking down the infrastructure. And one of our key concerns in Ukraine is the nuclear infrastructure, the nuclear power network. Before the war started, 65% of Ukrainian power came from nuclear. It's now down to about 30%. Everybody knows the story of Chernobyl, what happened there in 1984, and of course similar with Fukushima. I don't need to tell anybody here that a couple of 100 miles away, or maybe even less, there is a nuclear power station on the coast of Iran on 3 fault lines. And the potential for accident there would directly impact us here in Qatar and other Gulf states. And the resilience to that is something that we need to consider. And the use of these improvised weapons, like nuclear power stations in Ukraine and elsewhere, is something that is really focusing our minds, and to me is the biggest concern at the moment. I unashamedly point out on the right-hand side of my slide a tweet, and it is a Telegram training program for people in Ukraine. It tells them how to survive a nuclear attack or accident. We also, at the beginning of the war, when there was a threat of chemical and biological attack, you might remember the Russians were talking a lot of false flag type attacks. From our experience in Syria, when the Russians were saying there was likely to be a false flag chemical attack, we knew pretty well that the next day that we were getting some chlorine barrel bombs from the Syrian regime. So this false flag attack, so at the beginning of the war, we produced an app on Telegram to teach civilians how to survive chemical and biological attack. And more recently, we produced one on how to survive nuclear attack. Because the resilience in a war zone like Ukraine, where the civilians have been attacked, you can't give every civilian a gas mask, you can't give every civilian, a protective environment. But if you give them the basics, and I could talk all day about this, but a lot of what you do in a contaminated environment is counterintuitive. So if you have some very basic lessons to follow, then to me, that is the way to go. So yeah, if you have any friends in Ukraine who haven't got this app yet, please do tweet it out. But I believe that most people do have it. On the nuclear proliferation side, it's not just Russia, and I'm going to come back to that in my conclusion. We've had the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the global treaty, the UN treaty that controls this, for a lot of good reasons, didn't meet for 3 years, mainly because of COVID, but did meet last year. That is what we hang our hat on. However, the key treaty, the New START treaty between the Russians and the US to control warheads of the 2 most significant nations, the Russians have pulled out of recently, and that is a concern. We have a time where the Chinese are tripling their size, their number of warheads, in complete convention to all treaties. Of course, we have much talk of where Iran is in its nuclear program, and depending who you believe, depending how advanced they are. And North Korea, we know they have a warhead, and we know they have a missile. We don't think yet they've moved them together. So, and without mentioning Pakistan and India, and of course the 5 major nuclear nations, you can see that the proliferation since the end of the Cold War has been hugely significant. I, for one, are a massive fan of nuclear power to save the planet. And with fusion round the corner, virtually all our power needs in the next 50 to 100 years could be met by nuclear, a green fuel. But if we lose faith in it, because what's happening in places like Ukraine and the threats of its use, I think that'll be a huge detriment to the planet. The only bit of the unconventional violence that I haven't covered yet, and I'm not going to talk about chemical or biological. I mean, the only thing on biological, I think COVID is a massive wake-up call for all of us. I'm a so-called biological weapons expert. I've dealt with Al-Qaeda biological weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I sort of ignored them as being a major threat to the globe. But COVID has sort of changed that. 4,000 unregulated labs around the world, 1 million unregulated scientists. Some are probably people with malintent. I just want to cover the radiological side, what we call the dirty bombs. Again, Putin has threatened dirty bombs frequently during the Ukraine conflict. We know that 150 Russian soldiers died of radiation poisoning when they went into Chernobyl at the beginning of the war and dug around, which I think is terribly bad leadership from the Russian perspective, to allow their soldiers to go into a contaminated environment and kill so many of them. But we know they removed a lot of spent nuclear fuel, and where that has gone, nobody really knows. I know in the UK and the US we have very sophisticated networks for tracking this sort of stuff. I'm sure you do have here in Qatar as well. One of the benefits of radiological isotopes is they are relatively easy to detect, and they're very difficult to shield if you're trying to use them for malintent. You basically need a heck of a lot of lead or concrete, and carrying that around in a suitcase is likely to reveal your malintent. So on to my, I suppose, main real piece of this about Putin and nuclear weapons in Iraq, in Ukraine. Russian doctrine. Russian doctrine allows, at strategic and tactical level, for Russian commanders to use nuclear weapons in basically two scenarios. The first scenario is if Russia is directly under attack. And secondly, if Russia's nuclear capability is under direct attack. Now, this doctrine is quite old, from 2014. It was reviewed in 2020. And Putin has iterated on a number of occasions, even recently, that he sees that the 4 annexed areas of Ukraine that he illegally annexed a few months ago would construe, if he lost those, would construe a loss of Russian territory, inferring the potential that they would use some sort of nuclear type device. I think also Crimea is a key area. Is Crimea vital ground to the Russians, and is it vital ground to the Ukrainians? Now, we could discuss that the whole day, but I think Crimea might play a key part in what goes forward in Ukraine as far as the nuclear side. However, will Putin use nuclear weapons? Strategic weapons, the global Armageddon, I don't think so. I think there is absolutely no chance. There are too many checks and balances in place. There is no way that Putin or one of his acolytes could press the red button as a whim. There isn't a red button. There is a very complex way. And one of our key recommendations to the US government is dialogue. We must keep dialogue, all of us, with everybody involved in this. Because as Anton Guterres said recently, head of the UN, we are only one misjudgment, miscalculation, or misinterpretation away from disaster on the nuclear side. So I don't think strategic is something we all need to worry about. The tactical weapons, which are called battlefield nuclear weapons, are still massive. We're talking 10 to 15 kilotons. I was involved in remediation in Beirut after the explosion of the ammonium nitrate. That was about 2.5 kilotons, so about a quarter of the size of Russia's smallest tactical nuclear weapon. I don't think they can use them. They haven't been serviced or tested for 30 years or so. And this is not confidential information. Some of you might follow the British intelligence services on Twitter, who give a brief every day on Ukraine. And this is what they're talking about. Also, most of the tactical weapons are on on Iskander missiles that have a range of 400 miles. Therefore, Russia would have to move them close to the Ukraine border to use them. And I don't think there is any way that we would allow that to happen. So the tactical side, what really concerns me is, and I'm not concerned about dirty bombs because, as they have never really been effective in history. I'll come back. I won't come back to that, but we'll park that one. But nuclear power stations is what I'm concerned about, and where I'm directly involved to try and help. 6 nuclear power stations in Ukraine. Chernobyl obviously not working these days. The one that you will have heard of is Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power station in Europe, second largest in the world, occupied by the Russians at the moment. The IEA last week produced a report saying it is in a shocking state, the safety equipment and everything involved in it. So the chances of an accident there are very, very high. And certainly that's, battery running low. That's probably a task to tell me I've only got 3 minutes left. But the key thing about it is it's not necessarily a missile hitting Zaporizhzhia. We're not going to see a meltdown and some sort of improvised nuclear device. But if the cooling system fails, we could see a meltdown and fire, which could potentially put massive amounts of contamination into the environment. All that contamination at the moment is heading west. So you could see why Russia wouldn't be too concerned about that and could have a huge impact. So what to that? What we are calling for and what the IEA and I think the world community is calling for is demilitarized zones around those nuclear power stations so that there cannot be, because of course each time a missile lands in Zaporizhzhia, apparently it's the Ukrainians firing it, despite the fact that most of them have Russian markings on them. So that would be a way to take that threat off the a concern to everybody. Because when Chernobyl blew up, most of the radiation actually fell in the UK, in Wales, a small part of the UK, and farmers couldn't sell sheep for over 10 years. So it could have a huge impact, across Europe, or if the weather changes, it could even come down this way as well. So it's very important we take it off. So really, in conclusion on the nuclear piece, despite the fact that I've said I do not think Putin is going to go nuclear, the fact that the international community, particularly the Americans, the other nuclear powers, have, in contrast to the Russians, have something called strategic ambiguity. We like to think the Russians don't know what we'd do if they go to the nuclear button. I think that is something that needs to be changed, and something that the international community needs to tell the Russians exactly what would happen if they go for the nuclear button. Doctrine allows the Russians to go there, and the Soviets and the Russians are absolutely fastidious about following doctrine. I think there are some key triggers that we need to be very wary of, and Crimea, to me, is probably one of them. But I think the fundamental piece is that it needs to be made absolutely clear to Russia that any use of nuclear, be it tactical or even attacking a nuclear power station, will very much lead to the end of Putin and will get the NATO fully involved, because that is the last thing that the Russians want. It's a very rapid run through, very happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Sorry, I forgot to mention that Hamish is, as he said, a visiting fellow at Magdalen College at Cambridge. He's a reserve officer in the Army Staff Corps and a senior CBRN advisor and mentor to the UK Ministry of Defence, and is currently advising the Ukrainian government. Our next speaker, Tomasz Smura, is director of the research office at the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation. Excuse me if I've mispronounced that. And he's a member of the CPF board. He's a graduate of the Institute of International Relations at the University of Warsaw, and he previously studied at the University of Nottingham as well. And Thomas is going to speak to us now about the modernization of the Chinese People's Liberation Army and its impact on doctrines of and dynamics of international security. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Oh. Okay, thank you. So I also would like to start with saying thank you to Arab Center for having me here in such distinguished panel, and especially to Omar and your team for organizing such beautiful event. I have organized some events in my life, so I know that it's very, very, very huge effort to putting it all together. So the modernization of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So it's a huge topic, as everything in China. But nevertheless, I will try to stick to the time limits you imposed on me. So let me start with saying that among the most important developments of 2020, definitely the 20th Congress of China Communist Party was one of them. During this, along together with appointing Xi Jinping for the third time, which is also quite significant for CCP Secretary General, the basic developments goal were confirmed. On the path of the implementation of Chinese vision of a great socialist country by 2049, which basically means the global superpower status by the 2049. The goal concerning the People Liberation Army was also mentioned, and it required PLA to accelerate the process of the modernization to become modern armed forces by 2027. So according to Department of Defense, the last year report to Congress concerning the People Liberation Army, the PLA right now is developing capabilities to fight and win the war against stronger enemy, which basically means United States, to make sure that no third party will involve in any conflict in the region, would basically mean Taiwan, and to be able to project power globally. So let me say a few words about People Liberation Army itself. So with the 2.2 million soldiers, it's definitely the largest armed forces on the world in terms of the numbers. It consists 5 branches, or land forces, navy, air force, missile force, and strategic support force, which are about space and information domain capabilities. They are grouped into 5 so-called operational theaters and are overseen by the 7 members Central Military Commissions, which is composed mostly on the most senior generals, with one exception, which is Xi Jinping as a chairman himself. Among the goals of Chinese armed forces indicated in Chinese white papers, there are a couple of them. You know, they're more or less there are traditional, which you can find in any strategic, documents of any countries, like territory integrity, the security of the citizens. But 3 of them are especially interesting. One is stopping the independence of Taiwan, safeguarding China's interests overseas, which shows that China right now definitely has a global aspiration, and to protect China's maritime rights and interests, which is basically the signal for Chinese neighbor, who are involved in the conflicts with China. And what is also quite important, there is a strict connection of PLA and the party. So in any country on the world, the army is connected to the state. But in Chinese, in the strategic documents, it's emphasized that the PLA should strategically support the goals of China Communist Party, and it should follow the CCP orders. When it comes to the modernization goals, so as Xi Jinping set as a main goal, it's world-class militarily by 2049. Which, according to the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, mean against that it means the force which is equal, or in some dimensions even extending the capabilities of United States and other countries which are perceived by Beijing as a threat. In 2017, the 19th National Congress set also two intermediate goals, on this way to 2049 world-class armed forces. The first one for 2020, it's about mechanization, informatization, and strategic capabilities. And the second goal for 2045, which is about doctrine and equipment. And by 2045, the armed forces are expected to finish their process of modernization. But as I mentioned at the beginning, in 2019, what was also confirmed at the last Congress, the armed forces are expected to accelerate modernization process and become modern forces by 2027. Of course, as you see, there is a clear link between 2049 world-class military and 2049 great rejuvenation and modern socialist country status, which mean global superpower doom, as I mentioned, and it's clearly set by Chinese. Ambitious modernization plans are fueled and supported by huge and ambitious military spending. So right now, this year, according to CIPRI, the Chinese defense spending measured in current US dollars are about $300 billion. The US one are still like $800 billion, but it's worth mentioning that since the 26th, the Chinese spending tripled, while the United States defense spending remained basically at the same level. So when it comes to the modernization by branches or capabilities, so in the land forces, the Chinese has at its disposal around 1 million soldiers in land forces. They are grouped into around 70 brigades. Some of them are heavy, medium, light, so they are pretty similar to the structure which United States Army has. In land forces, Chinese have around 6,000 mine battle tanks, around 7,000 infantry fighting vehicles, plus 900,000 artillery pieces, and around 300 attack helicopters. And the modernization process right now is mostly focused on the precise strike capabilities, command control, and logistic. Nevertheless, the modernization challenges are huge. It's also because of the huge numbers. So when it comes to, for example, mechanized units, Chinese has in the mechanized brigades the most modern platforms, EAVs, together with the platforms from the 60s, like BMP-1. It's Soviet design from 60s. Similar when it comes to armored units, when there are still 1,500 MBTs. There are Type 59, which is, after Second World War design, still in service in the armed forces. When it comes to Navy is definitely the most modern branch of the PLA. It is also the largest fleet over the world, having around 340 vessels, including 125 large vessels like aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates. And the Department of Defense expect that by 2025, PLA Navy will have around 400 vessels in lines, and 440 by 2030. In the maritime dimension, Chinese are focused on power projection capabilities. As you all know, probably that 2012 it was first Chinese aircraft carrier deployed. The Soviet design Kutuzov modernized. After that, a couple of years later, Chinese launched their second, also based on Soviet design, aircraft carrier. And in 2024, the Chinese Navy is expected to launch first fully designed in China new modern, much bigger aircraft carrier, and these capabilities, their capabilities are supported also by a little bit smaller units like helicopter carriers, Type 75, and so on and so forth. Also, new generation submarines, the Jin type with the nuclear ballistic missiles are deployed. Two new of them will join the Navy soon, so it increased the number of strategic submarines in China to 6, and nuclear-powered attack submarines to 8. When it comes to the Air Force, with approximately 2,500 aircrafts, the Chinese. It was, by the way, the most outdated branch of the China armed forces, and the Chinese were dependent by many years on Russia's supplies. But they are quite quickly catching up with both Russia and the West. Right now, Chinese have more than 500 fighters, 800 multi-role fighters, and 120 bombers. Of those, around 400 are still J-7. It's the Chinese version of MiG-29. It's also like 1960 design, which has no chance on the current battlefield with against any Western platforms. Rest of fighters, there are Su-27, and there it's the Chinese version J-11. So they are also inferior to the Western fighters. And Chinese in 2015 bought 24 Su-35, which is quite modern, multi-role Russian fighters, which joined more modern multi-role Chinese platform, but still it will be only J-20 stealth 5th generation fighter, which probably changed the general picture of the Chinese aviation. But nevertheless, it's worth emphasizing that right now around 800 of Chinese fighters are considered as 4th generation fighters, so quite modern. And China is also introducing completely new capabilities like jamming aircraft, refueling capabilities, long range, transportation, and so on and so forth. And what is also quite important, China has one of the most sophisticated air defense system, which is mostly based on S-300 Russian SAMs and Chinese own version JQ-9. About a couple of words about external perception and external reactions to Chinese armed forces development. So as you can imagine, it's mostly the problem for Taiwan and also to United States, which is security guarantor in East Asia, but not only. Most of Chinese neighbors have somehow, or historical or territorial disputes with Chinese. It's especially true when it comes to Japanese. So, as you know, that China, the Japan relation for years, for decades, were haunted for some historical issues connected mostly to the Second World War, Japan imperialism, but their relations were conducted quite, well during the Cold War and 2 decades after that. But since 2010, when the Senkaku Island issue appeared, I would say that it was the turning point for Japanese. And that time, Japanese realized that China has really aspiration, to be great power in the region with significant military capabilities, and it was kind of wake-up call for Japanese. Since this time, Japan has started probably the biggest, shift when it comes to their security policy since the Second World War. So they changed completely their, the strategic documents, doctrines. There was first the Japanese national security strategy in 2014. This year, last year was the second version of it. The Japanese changed their approach concerning the defense spending through the whole the Cold War. They kept the defense spending below 1% of GDP. Right now, the official goal of the Kishida government is 2% of the GDP by 2027, which is quite significant, which is quite important because Japan traditionally was considered as a country with significant limitation when it comes to the military power. The Japanese armed forces are also, strengthened by new capabilities. So, for example, 2 new Aegis-equipped destroyers joined the fleet. The new helicopter carriers, Izumo, Kaga, quite big ships, which can be considered even as aircraft carrier, because Japanese decided that they will have, capabilities to also absorb F-35 stealth fighters. But what is also I'm saying about it, because Japanese traditionally, cannot, by their interpretation of constitution, offensive capabilities when aircraft carriers are definitely not about defense, but about offensive, operation. Japan also introducing the F-35, almost 150 were procured. Which is what is really significant number. It looks similarly when it comes to India, which also has some territorial disputes with China on the north, and of course China is also the closest ally of Pakistan, and as you know that there are serious dispute, and India consider Pakistan as its main enemy. So India continues development of its nuclear forces. The new ERBM, MRBM, short-range ballistic missiles as well are introduced. India also is changing and replacing the Soviet origin equipment with new generation systems. It concerns, like, for example, mine battle tanks. 500 of them are procured and will join the units soon. Also, modern Western systems are introduced, like 36 French Rafale fighters and so on and so forth. India is also increasing its defense spending, as in case in Japan. Also Vietnam, which also has quite difficult records when it comes to history with China. Historically, it was invaded many times by Chinese. There are still open territorial disputes as well. Vietnam, of course, it's a poorer country than Japan, so they cannot build the significant military power. But they are still, for example, procured like 6 kilo submarines or so 30, which can undermine the Chinese operation against Vietnam, for example. And it's about the internal processes and modernization decision in this country. But it's quite important also here, because it's academia conference, that we can also see how the theory of international relations work in this case. So clearly we have we can apply here the balance of power theory, which is a basis of realism. So we see here both, like according to Paul, there is external balancing and internal. So internal is about enhancing their own capabilities and strength, while we also see cooperation, kind of external balancing, between the countries which perceive the PRC as possible threat. So we all, saw the examples of cooperation between the countries in the region. The most famous is, of course, Quad, which consists of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. But there are also, the other formats of cooperation between countries of the region. So Japan, for example, enhances its bilateral cooperation with United States, with India, also with South Korea, but it's different case. We don't have a time to explain it. Also AUKUS, or form of cooperation between Australia, United States, and what is quite interesting, also United Kingdom. We have some colleagues here from UK, so we see that UK is also involved in the security of Indo-Pacific, and also Vietnam develops what is quite interesting, the relations with United States, which was historically arch enemy of this country, not so long ago. So just to conclude, last two sentences. So despite the great ambitions and technological capabilities of China's armament industry, it's still quite long way, for Chinese to build like very modern armed forces. They are quite quickly catching up with the United States and other countries, but there are still some significant challenges they face. And it's obvious that the growth of Chinese power and assertiveness is right now probably the most important factor which influence the security environment. And in Asia-Pacific region, it particularly concern Japan, India, Vietnam, as we discussed, along, of course, with Taiwan. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. Our next speaker is Tony Lawrence. Tony is Head of Defence Policy and Strategy Programme at the International Centre for Defence and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. And before moving to Estonia in 2004, he was a civil servant in the UK Ministry of Defence for 18 years. And as I said in the introductory remarks, Tony is going to speak to us about military assistance and war outcomes, Russia's war in Ukraine, with the particular emphasis on the challenges and opportunities that it presents to those states that are giving, offering, or are facing the demand for military assistance in this particular theatre of conflict. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, Beverly, for the introduction. And before I start, let me join my colleagues in saying a very public thank you to the Institute, to Omar and the team for the opportunity to be here. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to join you. So yes, I'm going to talk about the role of military assistance in Russia's war in Ukraine. And this is mostly a story about Ukraine. Russia's had some help too, but it's been of much lower volume and less impact. As you will all, I'm sure, know, most NATO and EU member states, along with states like Australia, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, have provided military assistance to Ukraine since the start of the full-scale war in 24th of February 2022, and in some cases before that. And the reasons they've done so, I think, are fairly straightforward. I mean, first of all, it's simply a moral position. The Ukrainian people have been victims of a brutal and illegal aggression, and they wish to defend themselves and their sovereignty, and their allies want to help them with more than just words. But it's also the case that the Allies and Ukraine share security interests in seeing Russia's aggression defeated. And these are sort of concrete aspects like removing or reducing the threat that Russia poses to European security, but also more abstract ideas like delegitimizing the use of military force and preserving the rule of law. At the same time, of course, the NATO allies have been very clear from the start that they would not themselves become directly involved and risk a NATO-Russia conflict with potentially unforeseen consequences, and so hence this policy of military assistance. According to the Ukraine Support Tracker, which I think is the best source of data on this subject, the supporting states have provided some 30 billion euros of weapons and equipment to Ukraine, and an additional 8 billion euros of what's called financial aid with military purposes. That's between January and November of 2022. The support tracker is updated on a regular basis. I think the next issue is actually due out tomorrow, 21st of February. And I think we'll see these figures have increased quite a lot given what's happening in the last few months. About 60% of that total has come from the US. Most of the rest has come from Europe. And just to place those figures in a bit of context, for the US donations, that amounts to about 2 to 3% of US annual defence spending. And for Europe, it's about 6 or 7% of EU total defence spending. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is make the case that the supporting states have generally been quite cautious in their supply of military equipment. But they have slowly stepped up, both in terms of volume and in terms of lethality and sophistication of the weapons they're providing. And that has had substantial impact. And notwithstanding the enormous courage and skill of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian armed forces, I think we have to conclude that without this assistance, Ukraine wouldn't have been able to fight for so long or to have achieved what it has on the battlefield. Ukraine received a certain amount of equipment from, a certain amount of assistance from 1991, and after 2014 also a certain amount of military equipment from donor states. But it's really not until February of last year that that began to grow in terms of volume and also in different types of equipment. So this was when lethal weapons were first began to be supplied. And it's generally been the case that among the European donors, those to the east of the continent have been more ready to provide equipment in terms of lethality, sophistication, speed, and volume than have those to the west of the continent. If you look at the figures relative to GDP, it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland who've been consistently at the top of the table. Still, throughout the war, the supporting states have imposed basically red lines on themselves over what they will provide, only to step over those red lines as the war has proceeded. So in the first few weeks, for example, they were only ready to supply small and portable so-called defensive weapons. Since then, step by step, they've ratcheted up to provide export or packed equipment, modern Western artillery pieces and air defence, modern Western armoured vehicles, and most recently, of course, main battle tanks. So what they've practiced here is a form of what Thomas Schelling, so him again, but what Thomas Schelling called salami tactics. You might know the metaphor of boiling the frog. The Western states have been able to escalate their assistance to Ukraine without escalating the war. I don't want to suggest that this has been some kind of deliberate plan. It's really been a response to the changing circumstances of the war, so a response to shifting external factors. And probably the most important of those external factors has been the reaction from Russia, or actually the lack of reaction from Russia. Russia's rhetoric has certainly been menacing. We've heard about the nuclear aspects already, but Russia has specifically threatened to attack arms shipments. In fact, it hasn't. At every step up we've gone, Russia has not really reacted. And I think we have to conclude that Russia is as keen to avoid a war with NATO as NATO has been to avoid a war with Russia. If I track back to the beginning of the war, nobody really expected Russia's military performance to be so poor. Russia expected a quick victory, and so did most foreign observers. And so the small portable weapons that were being supplied at the time, so this is things like Javelin, which is an anti-armour system, Stinger, which is an air defence system, were probably intended as much to support the insurgency that most observers expected would follow Ukraine's inevitable defeat at the hands of Russia, as well as to provide provide Ukraine with defensive options as well. These weapons are very easy to use. They don't need much training. They don't need much logistic support. There are lots of countries that can supply them in large numbers, but Ukraine was able to use them very effectively to help prevent Russia establish air superiority, and also to do things like picking off key vehicles in the logistics column, the armoured columns that appeared north of Kiev during the first stages of the conflict. And those tactical successes had strategic level effect. Ukraine's defence, supported by donated weapons, forced Russia to abandon its initial strategic objectives, to abandon its assault on Kiev, and to move instead to much more limited objectives in the east and the south of the country. Also at strategic level, Ukraine's victories forced the supporting states to reevaluate the content and the aims of their own supplies, their own assistance. If Ukraine was going to push back Russia in the east and south of the country, then the supporting states would need to provide more overtly offensive equipment. So things like long-range fires, armoured vehicles. And they chose to do so, stepping over a red line. The HIMARS system, which is the American long-range artillery system, rocket artillery system, is a notable example, an early and especially effective example. So during the summer of last year, these weapons allowed Ukraine to launch some really spectacular counter-offensives in the east and the south. And again, these successful operations had strategic level effect. Russia was forced to mobilize thousands, tens of thousands of troops. The Russian population was alerted to the fact that the special military operation had been sold was not really the case. And Russia showed that it could no longer protect even these fictitious entities it had established in Donetsk and Luhansk. And this potentially has much more serious geopolitical effects in terms of Russia's ability to sell itself as a security provider to its neighbouring states. It's possible at this point that Ukraine would have gone further and liberated more territory, but ammunition shortages began to kick in, and also the Western allies were not supplying the NATO standard equipment that Ukraine was going to need to go further forward. And it wasn't, in fact, until the closing months of last year that the allies agreed to do that, to supply their own weapons and equipment in anticipation of the war of movement in the spring, which we're now just about beginning to see. So things like medium-range air defence, multiple launch rocket systems, armoured personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks have all begun to arrive in some numbers. So that's where we are today. The war shows little sign of ending. Both sides seem to think they can achieve success still on the battlefield. And that means that Ukraine is going to require more military assistance, both more of what we've already provided, but also likely more sophisticated and lethal weapons. The next difficult argument, again, it's already started to bubble under, is going to be about the supply of combat aircraft. The larger problem here is that the supporting states have placed a very high premium on acting together and maintaining unity. But they have different assessments of the risks involved in this process. And the forward-leaning states get frustrated by what they see as the slow pace of progress, while the more cautious states feel themselves pressurised. So there are arguments, and the dispute we had over main battle tanks was not the supporting coalition showing itself at its best. I mean, it damaged the very unity that the supporting states are trying to achieve with this very public debate about main battle tanks. Apart from concerns about provoking Russia, the supporting states have also been held back by domestic considerations. And probably the most important of those is how to provide Ukraine with the immediate equipment and weapons it needs without degrading their own defence and deterrence. So supporting states, and particularly those to the east of the continent, who feel the threat from Russia more keenly, believe that the threat still exists or will be reconstituted very soon, and they need the means to defend themselves and deter Russia's action in their own area. On top of that, the capacity of the manufacturing industries is limited. There are global shortages in things like microelectronics, explosives, even basic stuff like castings. And all of that means that it'll be very difficult for these states to replenish whatever they donate to Ukraine in any sort of short period of time. And it's certainly not the case that anybody's emptying their inventories to send everything they can to Ukraine. Another domestic consideration is public support, and in fact this remains very high. In Europe at least, there are large minorities that agree with what their countries are doing to support the Ukrainians. One worrying trend here is America. There's a growing number of Americans who believe that the US is doing too much. About 25% at the moment would agree with that statement. And I think one factor here might be this long-standing discussion between the US and Europe about burden sharing, and the idea that Europe is not doing enough to provide for security on its own continent. Partly to address those kinds of concerns, the supporting states have established various mechanisms to coordinate their support and to support each other in supporting Ukraine. I'll just mention one here because I think it's an important one. It's important not only for support of Ukraine, but it's important in terms of the European Union's place in the world. But it's the European Peace Facility, which was a pre-existing fund that the EU has used in a very innovative way to provide about 3.6 billion euros worth of support to Ukraine. And it works by compensating EU member states from a common fund, which they pay into on a gross national income basis, for the equipment they've donated to Ukraine. And it means, for example, that Germany, which is Europe's largest economy, will pay about 25% of that bill. And smaller member states who would otherwise find it quite difficult to donate equipment have a chance of having large amounts of that donation replenished. I'll finish by talking about military assistance to Russia, which is a very different story indeed. And since I wrote the abstract and got around to thinking about writing the paper, I'm not sure that we should even classify this as assistance at all. I mean, certainly it's very much more transactional. It's also very much more covert because of the risk of international censure and then secondary sanctions. The country that's probably done the most is Belarus. Belarus has allowed Russia to launch attacks from its own territory, albeit under some pressure from Moscow. But I think that being the case, I would classify Belarus as a co-belligerent rather than an assisting state. Aside from Belarus, the state that's had the biggest impact in its support for Russia has been Iran. We heard yesterday about Russia's very cruel tactics of attacking the civilian energy infrastructure as a means of trying to freeze and starve the population into submission. And that caused huge damage. Ukraine was forced to divert resources from the front lines in order to deal with that. And ultimately, as Maria pointed out, this was not a successful strategy. But the point that I want to make in the context of this presentation is that those attacks were only really possible because of the availability in large numbers of Iranian loitering munitions and killer drones. And although Ukraine has claimed high success rates in shooting these down, it's the fact that they are very cheap and can be used in very large numbers, and you only need a few to get through to cause significant damage. And in return for that, and this is the transactional bit, Russia is reportedly considering supplying Iran with things like Su-35 fighter aircraft and the S-400 air defense system. Also, they've launched an Iranian intelligence satellite and of course, open trade relationships that help them both circumvent international sanctions. As for North Korea has supplied Russia with artillery shells, with rockets and missiles in numbers that US intelligence has described as substantial, but unlikely to change the outcome of the war. I mean, like Iran, North Korea stands to benefit politically and economically from its relations with Russia, as does China. It seems so far that China has not supplied Russia with weapons. Probably disappointing President Putin, who might have wished for this, given the state of the Russia-Chinese defense relationship. But there are suggestions that Chinese companies, and I'll leave it to you to decide for yourselves whether there's a difference between Chinese companies and the Chinese state. But anyway, Chinese companies have supplied Russia with non-lethal support. So things like navigation systems, jamming equipment, jet fighter parts. Most of this is probably going to come under the kind of dual use rubric. So China, this is very much a watch this space position at the moment. If you following the news from the Munich summit, the Munich Security Conference, Antony Blinken was suggesting that China might actually be on the verge of supplying Russia with weapons. So just to summarise, notwithstanding the extreme courage of the Ukrainian armed forces, their innovative use of these weapons, I think it's not very likely that they would achieve the success that they have without military assistance from this coalition of donor states. And they've been able to turn their tactical and operational successes with these weapons into strategic level outcomes. The war is far from over. We currently seem to be at a very critical point. The next few months, I think, are going to be decisive. And if Ukraine's allies wish to see Russia defeated, they're going to continue to have to supply weapons in large numbers and of possibly increasing sophistication and lethality. So it's probably not an exaggeration to conclude that the final outcome of this war is going to depend to a very large extent on their continued will to do just that. So thank you, Beverly. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Tony. And last by no means least, our final speaker is Mahjoob Zweiri, and he is the director of the Gulf Studies Centre and professor of contemporary history and politics of the Middle East at Qatar University, where previously he was head of the humanities department. And in a very nice segue, actually, I think, between Tony's last words and Mahjoob's contribution, we're going to talk about, or rather, Mahjoob is going to talk about Iran and new regional security dynamics. Thank you very much.
شكرا بيفرلي. أسعد الله مساء.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Strategic Studies Unit and Omar Ashur. Thank you, Omar, for your wonderful organization. It's my pleasure to be with you today and share with you some ideas regarding Iran and new regional security dynamics. The question which is posed continually is, how does Iran think about its own security? Iran always is the opinion that its security can be achieved, and this starts from outside their national borders. If you want to be safe in Tehran, so you have to be far away from Tehran's borders. If we took this theory with us and carried it around and came to the beginnings of the 21st century, we will notice that three major shifts have taken place which tested this theory and more or less reshuffled all the cards and the Iranian security consideration. Iran used to think they had a commanding position politically, from the political identity point of view, and because of it shares the same school of thought in Islamic jurisprudence with other countries. But what happened in the beginning of the 21st century, which led to this shift in the considerations of Iranian national security? The first was the fall of the political regime in Iraq, and Iran going back to the basics of the religious sectarian position. Iran didn't like that because Iran thought it has achieved a lot in improving its image and the perception of Arabs and Muslims towards it. Going back to square one and the square of Iran being a sectarian country was a backward step, because this has deprived Iran of the soft power tools and forced it into using solid power tools to defend its prestige. Therefore, from 2003 until now, Iran is suffering because of it, and attempted through public diplomacy, both covertly and overtly, to achieve this, but it has not achieved that in the eyes of the Arab elites and political elites and the public opinion. Iran is a sectarian country which is interfering in Arab countries' affairs. This has increased the burden of Iran. The second shock wave came with the Arab Spring, which continued in the aftermath of the fall of the Iraqi political system, and Iran was thinking that it was the country which ended the 20th century with a revolution, and this revolution managed to get rid of the biggest despotic regime, that of the Shah, and bring into power a popular revolution. And what happened in Egypt and other countries, the Iranian experience was tried again, but it was tested. In Iran, in Iran, you used to think of their principles as taking precedence over interest. When the Arab Spring took place, the Arab masses and Arab elites became more convinced that Iran puts interest first and sides with the despotic regimes rather than peoples and revolutions. And this is contrary to Articles 4 and 7 of the Iranian Constitution, and raised questions about the support which was given to Iran in the Arab countries was free of charge, and it was given to Iran wholesale. Now Iran was losing that without being able to regain anything to compensate that. The final thing was the nuclear issue. The nuclear issue was supposed to have given Iran more prestige as a nuclear power. It entered into negotiations with the West to play with the big boys, the members of the nuclear club, reached an agreement. After only 18 months, the whole thing collapsed. The U.S. withdrew, and Iran lost also in this regard, and the three pillars which Iran's prestige and case stood on have been lost completely. And this kind of thinking required going back to the square of solid power, and secondly, going back to military operational military uses. For this reason, In 2015, Iran decided to interfere militarily directly in Syria, and for the first time moving from the position of non-state actor and sends the green berets of its revolutionary forces to aid Bashar al-Assad's regime under the pretext of this was upon the invitation of Bashar al-Assad and in aid of Hezbollah. Shortly after that, Iran decides to engage in more military cooperation, and that is to open up the Hamadan air base in southern Iran to allow Russian aircraft to use it to counter the activities of anti-revolutionaries in Syria. And for this reason, the Russian Air Force from Hamadan Air Force started being used to attack ISIS in both Syria and Iraq with more precision. This was an important military development. Iran did not need to do this before these three shifts, and these shifts were made Iran rethink its strategy. So now, if we talk today about Iranian Russian military cooperation, we have to back to 2016 when the first use of the Hamadan air base started being used, which ushered a new era in the Iranian-Russian cooperation. And this meant that Iran started losing its grip over the powers of military intervention. So now Iran is saying that protect me in the skies and I'll do the job on the ground in Aleppo and elsewhere. These three shifts made Iran realize that it could not respond to these developments. So therefore, the military cooperation, which started in Hamadan and was extended to Syria, turned into Iran into another aggressive state to defend its interests and uses all the tools at its disposal, like interfering militarily, selling weapons, etc. From the point of view of Iranian decision makers, this is understood. But from the point of view of the opponents of Iran, this was not rejected. Like the Israelis are saying that Iran is using its influence to market its weapons in 50 countries, and the Munich conference saw talk of this kind. So all the theory of defending Iran's security from the nice, kind image, soft power, etc., into a country using all military means like drones, military intervention, and the last attack 48 hours ago, which the Kafr Sousa area in Damascus was attacked. A position was attacked, which was the same place where Imad Mughniya was assassinated in 2016, and it's the same position which has offices of the Syrian intelligence and an Iranian school. So there is a vicious war going on in Syria between Russia, Israel, and Iran. Some say there has been more than 200 attacks in an undeclared war, and Iran is losing this war because of its inability to admit before the international community that it has a presence in Syria, because they keep maintaining that we only have advisors in Syria. We do not have a military presence as such. This is why they are biting their nails and trying to withstand the pains because of the lack of the ability of to admit. For all these reasons, Iran is having to use all the hard and solid power now, and all their principles about defending the cause in Palestine and all of that has taken the back seat now. So what has the regional security lost now? Now we have the first impact of all these policies, that the phenomenon of the map of failed states has expanded from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Afghanistan to Yemen. All these areas, if you look at them, that in all of them Iran is present. What does it mean when we say that this country is a failed state? It means neither economically nor security-wise or politically this country is able to protect or defend itself. Like, for example, they can have a terrorist threat, but their lack of economic power makes them unable to do something. And also, for example, when the Iraqis refused to pay Iran $5 billion for electricity that they get from Iran, the Iranians cut off their electricity supplies. When Bashar al-Assad couldn't pay for the oil he gets from Iran, they cut off the oil supply. They said, you either pay or nothing. So therefore, no more, there was no room anymore for any principles, because the international community's pressure on Iran is translated into Iranian positions on the ground. So practically speaking, all the aspects of the Iranian security theory for Iran and the region is now gone with the wind. Nothing is there anymore. The increase of the instability in the region, the lack of instability inside Iran, and because the country is unable to keep up its promises. When the latest wave of demonstrations and protests, the regime could not suppress them. They disappeared. The protesters disappeared out of their own accord. They used to demonstrate when they like and go home when they like. The security apparatus could not suppress them. And so this means there is more political, what these demonstrations have achieved. They have achieved more pressure on Iran, more political isolation, and no nuclear deal. The Iranians saw a breakthrough to break this cycle of reviving the nuclear deal. The opportunity was lost. I'll conclude by these three developments that I talked about at the turn of the century. In my opinion, the more the pressures of these factors increase, it will increase the ferocity and the viciousness, if we can call it that, of Iranian policies vis-a-vis the countries near them. If they can do that with their allies in Iraq and Syria, we can only imagine what they will do with their enemies. Now there is a perception that the West does not want to go back to the nuclear deal. The West thinks that the Iranian regime is weak politically, economically, so why should throw them a lifeline? So therefore we should take into consideration that the impact of all of this will be reflected in the events of the Middle East, the Gulf, and what happens in Russia will impact the energy market, and it will impact the Gulf and the world energy market too. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا على هذا العرض القيم. أعرف ما رأيكم، ولكن أعتقد أن استمعنا إلى أفكار
Gulf, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, in Taiwan, in the Straits of China. But nevertheless, all joking aside, these are incredibly sobering and insightful presentations. I am not going to hog the chair's privilege by asking all of the questions. I'm going to open the floor to questions from all of you. Before we proceed, may I just kindly ask that if we could privilege questions for Dr. Mahjoob first, because he has something to go off to. So if there is anybody who, first of all, would like to ask any questions of Mahjoob, and then if we can follow up with questions for the other members of the panel. And maybe, shall I just take maybe 2-3 questions at a time? I think that would be a good way to do it. So hands up, and please, if you're happy to identify who you're affiliated with, that would be wonderful as well. Okay, so we have the gentleman over there. Yep. And then the gentleman in the red tie, and then the young woman in the grey shayla, and then in the red jacket. So, thank you.
السلام عليكم. جزاك الله خير دكتور محجوب على هذه الكلمة اللي ألقيتها.
This presentation, I have two questions. The first question as to the reaction of the Iranian regime vis-à-vis the Israeli strikes. Actually, this has not been covered clearly, and our role as Gulf countries or Gulf states, Gulf regimes. What is the wise approach vis-à-vis Iran? Thank you. شكرا على السؤالين المقتضبين والمباشرين.
Mazen Isa, I'll ask in English. The question is, although the West and Israel and the US have shown animosity towards Iran and have tried to cap its dreams of becoming a nuclear power and so on, but at the same time, it seemed at certain points in history that they also prevented it from collapsing, because it seems like a balance to the other half of the Arab and Muslim world aspirations. Do you think it's in their interest, the US and NATO, to let Iran sort of collapse? By collapse, I don't mean the country, I mean the regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, these questions are wonderful. So short. Love it. The young woman behind you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahjoob. My name is Hamida from the Arab Center. I'm going to also be short. I mean, I understand that the negative perceptions of Iran within the Arab world is obviously related to the sectarian concerns and also Iran's role in different countries such as Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and so on. And also it increased following the Arab Spring. All of these are understandable, but I also wanted to highlight that the grievances, there are both legitimate grievances on both ends. So that's why I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what are the steps that both sides can take to reduce tensions and come up with a security framework that works for both? And also, if you can elaborate on the role of external actors. Thank you.
So we'll just take those first 3 questions from Mahjoob so that he may then leave us. And then we'll take a sweep around with all the other questions. Is there one other person perhaps who has one other question? Yes, this young woman over here. Thank you.
السلام عليكم دكتور سؤال للدكتور
My question is addressed to Dr. Mahjoob. The current transition in Iran and the weakness of the economy in Iran, will it result in a revolution like the 1979? And will Iran change its position vis-à-vis nuclear deal? محجوب أنت محظوظ بالفعل بأسئلة ممتازة.
السؤال الأخير. أنا لا أعتقد بأن التحولات اللي بتصير في إيران ستدفع إلى ثورة جديدة. الشعب الإيراني
going to, or the transformations are going to lead to a new revolution. The people believe a new revolution means a new chaos. They hope for change. And I think that even Arabs, after the Arab Spring, started believing this. Although there is a new strategy, so we need to reconsider the way we think when it comes to the change. The new Iranian generation may be you want a change from within the regime, improving the performance of the regime. People maybe do not have a problem with the figures in the regime. They want to stop the corruption. They want to stop the security power, the hijab not being imposed, personal freedom. So they have a lot of demands, and if the regime listens, things would be solved. But the problem is the ideological aspect is still in control, and this makes it difficult to contact and to be in communication with the young men and women. Women are 51% of the Iranian society. So the hijab issue, for instance, is impactful in Iran. And I do not think that this will lead to a revolution. I think people are aware that we need to gradually push for change. And this is why I talk about cumulative revolution, cumulative demonstration and rallies. It is more important than just separate demonstrations or manifestations. So we have 6 waves, and in the past, every decade we used to have one rally. So 79, 89, 99, 2009. But recently we had 6. So this means that there's a shift in the public opinion, and they want to gradually push for change. Despite all that, 400 people were killed during the last demonstrations. When it comes to the response, the problem of Iran when it comes to Israeli strikes, actually they deny their presence in Syria. 2, they try to play it down. So they don't recognize it. Even in Iran, when they get the bodies of their fighters, they say we are defending Sayyida Zainab shrine. So they have this ideological, religious, sectarian aspect to it. Nobody knows how they were killed. So when Iran tries to retaliate, it tried to retaliate in Bulgaria. The Bulgarian authorities knew this, and it would have led to a diplomatic problem. In 21-22, they attempted in Istanbul. The Turkish government warned them against actually messing with the security of Turkey. They have 2 options: inside Palestinian territories, the occupied Palestinian territories, and the other solution is the cyber warfare, because they have capabilities to wage a war on a cyber level when it comes to water, when it comes to the railway, etc. in Israel. As to your question regarding Gulf countries, the Gulf countries say what's happening between Iran and Israel, this is between them. We do not want to meddle. It is clear that all Gulf countries, even the countries that do not like Iran, do not want a confrontation. They want to contain the situation, when it even to include Saudi Arabia. But how will this be contained? So Iran offering more concessions at a certain level in order for negotiations to become possible. So there's few things that the Gulf countries can do. For instance, there's mediation between Ukraine and Iran, and also between Iran and the United States by Qatar when it comes to the prisoners, etc. But there are no additional roles. The other countries are exhausted, and they want to find solutions away from a clear-cut role. When it comes to the collapse of the regime in Iran, this is no longer acceptable. Regime change is not accepted because the West think that a collapse like in Iraq and in Afghanistan is a catastrophe. So they understand this. They want change, but without having a collapse of the regime. They want surgical change, gradual change, and this needs patience and time. When it comes to the role, yes, of course, there are common grounds. So there are 3 important things for the Iranians: the vision, the narrative, and the action. So the perception first, and then the narratives, and then the action. We need to talk about these 3 things very clearly. Until now, the Iranians and the Arabs do not talk about this. They talk directly about actions, but they do not talk about perceptions. What is the problem when it comes to your perception. So this the triangle of fear. If you do not start with the perception and if you do not change the narrative, the action cannot change. The solution should be in this direction, or else we will be in this blame game forever. شكرا جزيلا. سوف أفتح.
2 questions for all of the other panelists. So I believe the gentleman in the red jacket, the gentleman in the dark jacket with his hand up, and the young woman behind the gentleman in the blue jacket. I'm colorblind, by the way, so I could be getting everything completely wrong. So we'll take 1, 2, 3 questions. We'll allow the panelists to answer them, and then we'll take another round of questions. I think I can use the chair's privilege to go slightly over as we started later than we expected. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is to Dr. Hamish. My name is Muhanna Saloom. I'm from the Critical Security Studies program here at the Doha Institute. You mentioned that the possibility of using strategic nuclear weapons in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is pretty much low. But equally, you mentioned that the tactical use of nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons is equally very low. For some reasons. One of them is the range, probably 400 kilometers, and the yield of the nuclear bombs available or warheads. Are there newer versions of tactical nuclear weapons, maybe with lower yields, lower than 10 kilotons, and longer range missiles to carry them? And if this kind of weapons are used, what are the implications? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take a couple more questions if that's all right, if there are any other. So the gentleman in the, I think it's a dark blue jacket. But
yeah, it is dark. It's grey, actually.
I'm very proud of myself.
Abdul Karim Xayas from King's College London, health system expert. Thank you for all the panelists. My question is to Hamish. So Hamish, while maybe we have not seen a use of a nuclear weapon since the World War II, but we've seen a lot of use of chemical weapons in the last decade. So what we can learn from the way we deal with this, your presentation focused on the maybe the preparedness on state level, on government, but what about community at the first hand level, and also in terms of accountability? So when it comes to community, in terms of resilience, you mentioned some basic steps can maybe protect people, but what we can do more, also about awareness, about the psychological impact maybe, and also about accountability on international level.
Thank you. And I'll take the third question for this round of questions from the young woman behind the man in the front row here. Thank you. And then I'll take, after the answers, I'll take another set of questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
منيرة النعيمي, Security Studies.
نعيمي من طالبة في الدراسات الأمنية في معهد الدوحة. سؤالي للسيد.
Firstly, thank you very much in the presentation. Some of the modern priority that you mentioned are for participation in a potential conflict in Taiwan and stop them from being independent state. But are we going to expect in some point China will use military forces to rejoin Taiwan with China, and in the long term, even though this action will lead to a war between China and the US? Thank you.
Okay, Hamish? Yes. Oh, I don't. What does everybody think? Yes, you may. You may.
If Thomas can elaborate, just on the same token as Munira said, just how difficult is an amphibious operation against Taiwan? Very simple.
You were allowed that one. Thank you. Hamish, would you like to start first?
Yes, sure. On the first one, and thanks for the question, a really good question. This is sort of probably the bounds of confidentiality and security. As far as more modern nuclear weapons are concerned, I think what appears to be in the public domain, maybe you're talking about the hypersonic missiles and also the nuclear torpedoes. You're absolutely right that they would appear, from what we know, to be much lower yielding, but the ability to get through defences and also precision targeting. And I think we're seeing from Ukraine actually precision targeting is turning the balance. So if you could very precisely target a lower yield, maybe 2 kilotons of a nuclear device, yeah, it could be hugely effective. I think as far as the West is concerned, the best of my knowledge, the West, I mean the Americans, the Brits and the French have not gone down this route. There is not development in nuclear technology in that sphere. But from the Russian perspective, as far as I'm aware at the moment, this is aspirational rather than actual. And I bound it in with my other points on the nuclear threat in Ukraine. The main thing is, and somebody else has said it, Russia is as keen to avoid direct fight with NATO as NATO is with Russia, and any use of nuclear, be it modern nuclear or any others, would make that happen. So it's a threat for the future, no doubt, that we all need to focus on. On Karim's question, I think I mentioned that the report we've written for the US government includes the use of chemical weapons potentially in Ukraine, and I hate to answer for the Ukrainian people. I'm hopefully humble enough I could not possibly do that, but I know that the Ukrainian people are incredibly concerned about not only the use of chemical weapons, but only the use of nuclear, but also chemical weapons, which is why, as Karim, you know well, in Syria, the only thing that we could do to protect the civilian population was to train them how to react to chemical attacks. And the dreadful thing in Syria is we're talking about chlorine, we're talking about ammonia, we're talking about cyanide that's readily available and very deniable. But as far as resilience goes, absolutely. For those who remember the Cold War, those who perhaps spent time living in the States and the UK, there was an awful lot of resilience for the civilian population on exactly what to do in the event of these type of attacks. And it's pretty straightforward. And I'm of the school of thought, there's a balance between reassuring the population and terrifying the population. And it's all a balance of threat. When it comes to nuclear at the moment, in my humble opinion, the balance is it's much better to be forewarned and forearmed and trained to provide that resilience than worrying people unduly. And in the Cold War, that was accepted. So absolutely, I think I mentioned, with any threat, you can be resilient again, even nuclear. Unless you're within that sort of couple of kilometers of the detonation, if you know what to do, you've got a very good chance of survival. And if you avoid the radiation, basically stay under cover for 24 hours for it to disperse or hit the ground, you've got a very strong chance of survival. But, it's the psychological impact of these weapons that absolutely terrifies people. But it's, because I've been in the environment, as I said with the Peshmerga, I've been in a chemical attack. I would far prefer to be in a chemical or nuclear attack than have somebody standing in front of me with a shotgun, because then you've got no hope. So that's probably not a very good answer to your questions.
Well, I think you're maybe diminishing my psychological fear factor. At least I feel as if I'm beginning to be prepared in case the wind blows the wrong way towards Qatar. Tomasz.
Okay, thank you, lady in the second row, and follow up from Omar's side. So, basically, Taiwan, it's absolutely priority for China, and it's, all this military development, it's also about Taiwan. And China never, China reserved the right, so-called, to use the force, to extend control over Taiwan, and they never resigned from this right, let's say. But of course, it's very difficult thing. My personal opinion, it's shared also by some senior generals from United States, that China is not there yet. So, I spent some time in Taiwan, and actually, Taiwan is like a rock in the middle of the ocean, 100 kilometers from the sea line, from the land. It demands a very complicated amphibious operation. You're right. Remember that D-Day Normandy operation. It was English Channel, which is 20 kilometers wide, so it's more complicated. Taiwan. It's quite strong, resilient, military power. They have quite significant armed forces. I think that for sure they will be supported directly or indirectly by United States, probably also by Japan, maybe Australia, and we see how it looks when it comes to Ukraine. So there are enormous risks for China to start such kind of operation. It would be huge, massive. You need to transport probably maybe 0.5 to 1 million troops, through the channel to be sure that you conduct this kind of operation, which is really challenging. So there are always a lot of unknowns. It was the same case before the Ukraine. Looking at situation at Ukraine before the war, I was sure that Putin would never, came into Ukraine with the force which he had at disposal. But you never know, what is inside. Probably Putin was, around him there was yes men, who, were afraid to say Putin the truth about the state of Russian armed forces, logistic issue, and so on and so forth. It can be also the same about Xi Jinping. After the 20th Congress, his fraction dominated the leadership. All the in China there was some autocratic check and balances, but they are slowly disappearing. So I don't know. Maybe there will be. It can be also same case and as in case of Putin that maybe he's in his bubble and he has not like proper information, and there is the biggest risk. But from the rational point of view, I think it's definitely better for Chinese, to wait and working, on the development, and also, to continue their policy, treating of military force as a last resort in the process of reunification.
Thank you, Thomas. Just a brief counterpoint to that, which is that, after Ukraine, there were a number of analysts who said that this would act as a deterrent against that very move from Beijing towards Taiwan. Would you, in one word, subscribe to that view? Yes or no?
I think so. So taking a look, at the situation of Ukraine, if I were Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership, I would never, start this operation against Taiwan, because my last sentence, there is a huge difference between Chinese and Russian armed forces when it comes to doctrines, equipment, and so on and so forth, when the Taiwanese operation would be much more difficult, as I said.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll open up the floor for the last round of questions, so put your arm up quick. The gentleman here, the young woman there, and the gentleman there. As you've asked a question, if you don't mind, I'll allow the privilege to go to others who have. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? So we'll do it in that order. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, thank you.
So,
yes, sir.
Thank you. Ahmad Mansour from the Doha Institute. Thank you, everybody, really, for the talk. I have really one intriguing question for Tomasz. If you can really humor me and answer that. How would Warsaw interpret the numbers that you just gave strategically? How would it make sense of the transformation of the capabilities? given that there's a current really shock that happened in the region? You just really spoke about the expected and the unexpected. So how would decision makers see all those numbers and think about them in alliances and foreign policy? So what's the view from Warsaw? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And number 2.
Rashid Al-Mahannadi from the Critical Security Program here in Doha Institute. So my question is for Mr. Hamish. So we have a good idea of conventional, nuclear, and chemical capabilities of nations. But coming to biological capabilities of nations. So my question is twofold. One, how well do we understand the capabilities, the industrial, technological, and the ability actually to deliver such weapons? Two is how easy is this technology proliferated compared to other CBRN threats?
Thank you. And question
thank you. Maria Zolkina, London School of Economics. My question goes to Professor Lawrence. Speaking about military assistance to Ukraine, how do you see the specific, I will make it more clear now, how do you see the specific interdependence between political decisions or political will, to have a specific result, and specific model of victory, let's say, of Ukraine in this war on the one hand, and the actually military assistance itself? Because the strategy or tactics which was used last year when assistance was restricted to specific quantities and types of weapons cannot work 100% effectively when it comes to the goal to deoccupy entire Ukrainian territory. And another side of the coin is what's going on, if you can elaborate on that, in the military industries of main Ukraine's military partners, because now we're using stockpiles, but we need military industries to reshape their activities and production.
Thank you very much. And the final question to the gentleman behind the other gentleman.
أنا الطالب عبد الله حمد العذبة من برنامج الدراسات الأمنية.
Student from Critical Security Studies. Dr. Thomas, the question is addressed to you. You talked about the modernization of the Chinese army. So what are the repercussions of this modernization on the Gulf countries? Thank you.
Thomas. Together?
Yes, absolutely.
And
they're interconnected.
Lovely. And we'll maybe start with Tony.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for the question. I'm not sure I entirely was clear about what you were getting at with the first one, but I think when we look at the assistance that's been provided so far over the last year, it's been provided on a very piecemeal basis. And that's caused these really unfortunate arguments, particularly over the supply of main battle tanks, which are not good at all for the unity of the supporting coalition. I think we're about to have a similar one over F-16s, which again will be not good. And I think that means that the coalition has to come to some longer-term strategy of how it's going to supply Ukraine with what Ukraine needs in the coming months, years. I'm not sure what that strategy is, but the idea that we can continue to kind of set these red lines and step over them, that we can continue to do this kind of piecemeal supply, it's just not satisfactory. So that if that's the kind of direction you were heading at, that's my answer. In terms of military industrial capability, this is a sad story. The states of NATO and EU have themselves very limited stockpiles. And one of the things that the Ukraine war, again, another surprise from the war in Ukraine was that just the degree to which ammunition was used. It's like pre-industrial levels of ammunition usage. And states, examining their own stockpiles, realised that they were going to find great difficulty in fighting this kind of war themselves if they ever needed to. And unfortunately, these processes take an awful long time to get re-established. And we just don't have the capacity. We've fought for the last 20 years wars of choice in outside the NATO area, and our capacity is degraded. On the bright side, there are some steps now to try and improve that. There's an Action in Estonia initiative being discussed in Brussels, I think even today, which is about using the peace facility to directly procure ammunition in particular from manufacturers. But still, the problem of the manufacturers themselves having to ramp up their capacity to deal with this will be great. And it's a similar story in the States. I mean, in the States, places like Raytheon are just working flat out to produce things like Stingers, which are being used at such a great rate in Ukraine that it's, yeah, I don't want to sound too gloomy about this, but this is certainly a challenge that has to be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and then we'll finish with
Okay, paradoxically, those two questions are not very difficult, you know, to be combined somehow. So, view from Warsaw, you know, so it's not, you know, by mistake or because I'm interested in exotic country that I'm trying to follow this issue particularly. Or I wanted to spend some time, you know, on beautiful Taiwan, but it's really important also for my region and. You know, and the link is United States, because our main concern right now is that if we in Europe, you know, have two conflicts together, you know, one in Ukraine, which maybe can extend somehow, and you know, the second one over the you know, Taiwan Strait, it can be really serious problem also for United States. Against the background, you know, of the whole situation around Ukraine, we saw that NATO is basically based on United States. You know, it was United States which, as a first, deployed serious military capabilities. You know, to Poland, to Baltic states, to reassure allies. You know, it was United States who, as a first, provided Ukraine with significant weapon systems. Tony discussed it before. United States, even recently, you know, has broken this deadlock over the mine battle tanks, you know, for Ukraine. So basically, it's really important player in NATO. And you know, if it will be somehow involved in East Asia, it can bring some risks, and also, you know, it can make the Russians to escalate war somehow. And it's same about the Gulf countries. If United States is involved in Taiwan, in you know, developments in East Asia, probably they ability, you know, to stabilize the situation in Gulf somehow diminish, and also, you know, the conflict between you know, Taiwan and China, with United States probably involved, it's a huge thing. You know, they are two biggest economies of the world, with Japan as the third one. So, you know, all the lines of communication, the global economy, you know, the Russian-Ukraine war, you know, against the background of China-Taiwan war, it will be like playground for children, you know, because it will be much more concern for international, you know, the stability in financial terms, economic terms, and so on and so forth. So the consequences will be for us all, definitely.
Thank you, Thomas. And finally, Hamish, please. Thank you.
Finally, to finish on the bio piece, which I'm afraid it's not a good. It's an excellent question. I think it's something we will be focusing a lot more on in the future. How well do we understand the bio threat? I think not particularly well. When I was serving in the British Army countering this, I dealt with the Al Qaeda anthrax attack in Iraq back in 2005. And when I was in Syria, I investigated Daesh trying to introduce plague to refugee camps. And some of you might remember a Tunisian scientist called Abu Malak was taken out by coalition forces, and he was allegedly trying to develop biological weapons for Daesh. When it comes to state actors, again, it is fairly hazy. I would point you to a very good open source French website called Open Facto, who did an in-depth study and produced a report of what they claim to be the Russian biological weapons program, focusing on Ebola to make it. Ebola is very virulent, but not very transmissible. And equally, I think when it comes to proliferation, COVID has really alerted a lot of people to bio. And the fact that 3 years after COVID was thought to have originated, we still don't know the origins of COVID. That is a huge concern because putting mitigation. One of my fellows at Cambridge dealt with the Lassa fever outbreak in the UK 2 years ago. Lassa fever is a very virulent pathogen originating in sort of Central Africa. One of the bits of work we did is whether you could splice Lassa fever with the COVID, with the SARS-CoV to produce a very transmissible virulent pathogen. And sadly, it's not that difficult. The regulation of biolabs, I mentioned briefly in my piece, is not very good. The UN has spent a lot of money on the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, about $400 million a year. We spend about $100,000 a year on the Biological Weapons Convention. This is something that needs to change. So painting a gloomy picture. However, on the positive side, with bio and with anything CBRN, it's all about detection. Once you know what you're facing, and if you can produce actionable intelligence, in other words, intelligence in a very timely fashion where people can make decisions in the bio world generally, because we have very good medical countermeasures, you can be resilient. And something like anthrax, when I was dealing with it, I was vaccinated against it anyway. But if you take antibiotics within a couple of days of ingesting anthrax, your chances of survival are 95% plus. Now, I'm not saying that's the same for every bio piece, but once we identify it, we are now very good at producing countermeasures. So although it's a gloomy picture, and I think it's something that we all in the security world are going to have to focus more on in the future, because let's face it, if you could claim responsibility for a pathogen that's killed over 4.5 million people around the world, cost trillions and trillions of dollars, and brought a lot of countries to their knees for many years, from a terror perspective, that is as good as it gets. But actually, it's not that easy to do. And as long as we are resilient to it and put measures in place to make sure it doesn't happen, I don't think it will develop. But it is something that certainly from the work I'm doing now and the work I know that's happening in the UK, it's something we really need to focus on in future.
Thank you, Hamish. I was taking notes in my head on what to do in terms of anthrax protection. I'm all vaccinated up for COVID, and I'll be working on all the other Lassa fever? I hadn't even heard about that one. So I hope that you were able to take, at least in those final words, some reassurance. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of all of you to thank our panelists. It was a truly excellent and exceptional panel. What a way to end a conference with such a good final panel. And on behalf of the panelists, may I also thank all of you, not only for attending, but for your excellent questions. So let's all give each other a round of applause, and thank you very much indeed.